Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts, floating on research stations in the Antarctic, living in the Sahara, thriving on every continent except one. We've built civilizations that stretch into the clouds, sent machines to the edge of the solar system, decoded the language of life itself. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. But 100,000 years ago, if you had looked at the world, the picture would have been terrifyingly different. Somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 humans left alive on the entire planet. Not 2 million, not 200,000. Just a few thousand individuals clinging to survival in a world that seemed determined to erase us completely. The entire future of humanity, everything we've ever built, every person you've ever loved, every thought you've ever had, all of it hanging by a thread so fragile, it's almost impossible to believe we're here at all. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I check the comments, and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, Texas at midnight, London during lunch break, all at once. It's this weird, beautiful thing where we're all together in different times. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize how close you came to disaster? Like when you're driving and a car runs a red light and misses you by inches. Your heart stops. Time freezes. You think, that was almost it. That's what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a split second. It was tens of thousands of years of barely, just barely hanging on. Generation after generation born into a world where extinction wasn't some abstract possibility. It was the morning alarm clock. It was the weather forecast. It was just reality. And here's the part that makes your skin crawl. For most of human history, nobody knew this happened. Your great-grandparents didn't know. The Romans didn't know. The Egyptians building pyramids didn't know. Even scientists studying human evolution didn't know just how close we came until very recently. We've been walking around, all 8 billion of us, completely unaware that we're basically living in the epilogue to a story that almost ended before it really began. See, there's always been clues. Geneticists have known for decades that something was off about human DNA. We're too similar to each other. Weirdly, suspiciously similar. Take a human from Norway and a human from New Zealand, people whose ancestors haven't shared a continent for 50,000 years, and their DNA is almost identical, like 99.9% the same. But compare two chimpanzees from forests just a few hundred miles apart in Africa, and they'll have way more genetic differences than any two humans anywhere on Earth. That's not normal. That's the signature of something catastrophic. That's what happens when a population crashes so hard, so fast, that only a tiny fraction survives. All the genetic diversity, all those little variations that build up over millions of years, just gone. Wiped out in an evolutionary blink. Scientists call this a population bottleneck, and they've been trying to figure out when it happened and how bad it was for over 50 years. They knew humans went through at least one major crisis. They could see it written in our genes like scars on skin. But the details were blurry, contested, frustratingly incomplete. Until recently. Until geneticists developed new tools that could read the story written in our DNA with unprecedented clarity. What they found was so shocking, so incomprehensible, that when the first studies came out, other scientists thought it had to be wrong. The numbers couldn't be real. No species survives that kind of collapse. But the evidence kept piling up. Study after study, different research teams using different methods, all arriving at the same horrifying conclusion. Around 100,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier, something happened that nearly deleted humanity from existence. Some catastrophic event, some perfect storm of disasters, pushed our ancestors to the absolute edge of extinction. And for thousands of years they teetered there, balanced on a knife's edge between survival and oblivion. What was it? What nearly killed us all? Was it a supervolcano that plunged the world into volcanic winter? Was it a disease that swept through human populations like wildfire? Was it climate change so severe that our ancestors' world literally dried up and blew away? Or was it something else, something we haven't even imagined yet? That's the mystery we're going to unravel tonight. We're going to travel back through 100,000 years of time, using the tools of genetics, archaeology, and climate science. We're going to visit a world that was trying to kill our ancestors in every way possible. We're going to meet the survivors, that tiny, desperate population that refused to give up when every logical evolutionary calculation said they should just go extinct like 99% of species eventually do. And we're going to discover something amazing, that the catastrophe that nearly destroyed us might be the same event that made us who we are, that our greatest weakness and our greatest strength might have the same source, that every human alive today carries the molecular memory of those desperate years when survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a miracle. So get comfortable, relax. Let your mind drift back through time to a world that almost was our end, but instead became our beginning. To understand how close we came to extinction, we need to go back to a time when humanity's future looked bright. A time when the world was filled with diverse human populations, each carving out their own evolutionary path. A time before everything almost ended. 200,000 years ago, Africa was alive with human voices. Not just one species, but multiple branches of the human family tree, all sharing the same continent. This was the world before the bottleneck. A world we can barely imagine today because we're so used to being the only human species left standing. The dominant group was our direct ancestors, early Homo sapiens. But they weren't modern yet, not in the way we think of modernity. These early humans looked mostly like us. Same basic body proportions, same bipedal stance, same relatively gracile bone structure. But their skulls were slightly different. Longer, lower, with more prominent brow ridges than you'd see on any modern human walking down the street today. And they weren't alone. Africa during this period hosted a surprising diversity of human and human-like species. Homo heidelbergensis, a robust, large-brained species that was probably ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans, still occupied parts of eastern South Africa. Homo naledi, a strange mosaic species with a small brain but surprisingly advanced tool use, lived in what is now South Africa. There were others too, species we've found fragments of but haven't fully identified yet. Fossils that don't quite fit into any category we've established. Think about that for a moment. The African landscape 200,000 years ago was like a massive human laboratory. Multiple experiments in what it meant to be human, all running simultaneously. Different body plans, different brain sizes, different survival strategies, all competing and cooperating in an ecosystem that was, at the time, remarkably supportive of human life. Because here's the thing about pre-bottleneck Africa. It was paradise compared to what came later. The climate during this period was relatively stable and, crucially, wet. The Sahara, which today is the world's largest hot desert, was green. Not everywhere, not constantly, but large portions were covered with grasslands, scattered trees, rivers, and lakes. Archaeological evidence shows hippos living in what is now the middle of the desert. That tells you everything you need to know about how much water was available. East Africa, the cradle of human evolution, was a patchwork of environments. Rift valleys with permanent lakes and rivers, highland regions with cool temperatures and consistent rainfall, lowland savannas where vast herds of animals migrated seasonally, forests along the coasts and major waterways. This environmental diversity created countless ecological niches that different human populations could exploit, and exploit them they did. The archaeological record from this period shows early humans spreading across the entire continent, from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south, from the Atlantic shoreline in the west to the Indian Ocean in the east. Everywhere we look, we find evidence of human occupation. These weren't small, scattered bands barely hanging on. The genetic evidence suggests pre-bottleneck human populations were substantial. Maybe hundreds of thousands of individuals spread across Africa, large enough to support significant genetic diversity, small enough that different groups remained connected through occasional gene flow. What were these early humans doing? How did they live? The archaeological sites paint a fascinating picture. They were making sophisticated stone tools, not the simple choppers and hand axes that their predecessors had used for millions of years, but carefully crafted implements designed for specific purposes. Scrapers for processing hides, points for spears, cutting tools with sharp, regular edges. Some sites show evidence of what archaeologists call prepared core technology. This is where you don't just bash rocks together until something useful falls off. Instead, you carefully shape a core stone so you can strike off multiple tools with predictable forms. It requires planning, abstract thinking, the ability to visualize the end result before you start. It's evidence of sophisticated cognitive abilities. They were hunting big game. Sites from this period contain the bones of elephants, hippos, buffalo, antelope, animals that require coordinated group efforts to bring down. You can't take out an elephant by yourself, no matter how good your spear is. You need teamwork, communication, strategy. The presence of large animal bones at human sites tells us these early populations had developed complex social cooperation. But they weren't just hunters. They were also gathering plant foods, catching fish, collecting shellfish along the coasts. Coastal sites from South Africa show massive shell middens, ancient garbage heaps that document thousands of years of systematic shellfish harvesting. This is evidence of dietary diversity, the ability to exploit multiple food sources depending on what was available. They were using fire systematically, not just opportunistically capturing natural fires, but creating and maintaining it. Archaeological sites show carefully constructed hearths, places where fires were built repeatedly over long periods. Fire means more than just warmth. It means protection from predators. It means the ability to cook food, making it easier to digest and extracting more calories. It means light after dark, extending the productive hours of each day. Most tellingly, they were using pigments. Red ochre, a mineral that produces a deep red colour when ground up, shows up at archaeological sites across Africa during this period. Why would early humans be gathering and processing pigments? Not for nutrition. Ochre is useless as food. The only logical explanation is symbolic behaviour. They were using it to decorate their bodies, their tools, their living spaces, maybe for ritual purposes, maybe for group identification, maybe for personal expression. This is huge. This is evidence that pre-bottleneck humans had developed symbolic thinking, the ability to create meaning beyond immediate survival needs, the cognitive foundation that would eventually give rise to art, religion, complex language, everything we think of as distinctly human. Their social structures were becoming increasingly complex. We can infer this from multiple lines of evidence. The size and organization of living sites suggests groups of 30 to 150 individuals living together. That's larger than basic family units. That's extended kinship groups, multiple families cooperating and sharing resources. The distribution of similar tool types across vast distances suggests communication networks. Ideas were spreading, maybe through direct contact as groups migrated, maybe through trade relationships, maybe both. But information was flowing across the continent faster than genes, which is the signature of cultural evolution. Some sites show evidence of division of labour. Not everyone was doing the same tasks. Some individuals specialised in tool making, others in hunting, still others in processing hides or preparing plant foods. Specialisation only makes sense in groups large enough and stable enough to support it. It suggests these weren't bands of nomads constantly on the move, but semi-permanent communities with established territories. They were probably developing proto-languages. Not necessarily the complex grammatical structures we use today, but sophisticated communication systems beyond simple calls and gestures. The evidence is indirect but compelling. The complexity of their technology requires teaching. You can't learn prepared core stone tool techniques just by watching once. Someone has to explain, demonstrate, correct your mistakes. That requires detailed communication. The coordination needed for big game hunting requires real-time information exchange. Who goes where, when to attack, how to drive animals toward kill zones. Gestures can only convey so much. At some point you need words. The genetic diversity during this period was remarkable. This is something we can actually measure today by comparing the DNA of different modern populations. Modern humans from different parts of Africa show more genetic variation between them than populations from anywhere else in the world. This diversity is the residue of the pre-bottleneck period when multiple distinct populations were evolving in relative isolation across the continent. These genetically distinct groups weren't different species. They could and did interbreed when their ranges overlapped, but they had been separated long enough to accumulate different genetic variants, different solutions to the challenges of survival. Some populations had genetic adaptations for high altitude living in the East African highlands. Others had variants that helped them resist malaria in lowland regions. Still others had developed genetic advantages for processing different types of diets. This diversity was our species' insurance policy. When environments changed, different populations had different survival advantages. A drought that devastated one group might barely affect another with different adaptations. A disease that swept through coastal populations might leave highland groups untouched. Genetic diversity meant resilience, redundancy, the ability to absorb shocks and recover. The landscapes these early humans inhabited were breathtakingly diverse. In East Africa, the Great Rift Valley was actively forming, creating a complex topography of mountains, valleys, lakes, and volcanic highlands. This geological activity brought minerals to the surface, creating rich soils that supported abundant plant and animal life. The savannas were not the monotonous grasslands many people imagine. They were mosaics of different vegetation types, open grasslands where herds grazed, scattered trees providing shade and fruit, thickets of thorny acacias, gallery forests following rivers and streams. Each microenvironment supported different resources. Early humans learned to exploit all of them. The forests were dense and challenging, but rich with resources: fruits, nuts, honey, small game. Forest edges were particularly productive, offering the best of both worlds: the shelter and resources of the forest, the visibility and hunting opportunities of open areas. Many human sites from this period cluster along forest-savanna boundaries. The coastlines offered yet another set of opportunities: tidal zones filled with shellfish, shallow waters where fish could be trapped in pools, seals and seabirds nesting on beaches and rocks. Some early human populations became coastal specialists, developing deep knowledge of marine ecosystems and tidal patterns. Highland regions provided refuge from heat and, crucially, from some diseases. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes don't thrive at high altitudes. Tsetse flies, which carry sleeping sickness, avoid cool temperatures. Early humans who moved into mountain regions escaped some of the disease burden that plagued lowland populations. The rivers and lakes were life-giving arteries, permanent water sources that supported rich ecosystems year-round. fishing, waterfowl hunting, hippo and crocodile hunting for those brave or desperate enough. River valleys provided travel corridors, natural pathways for migration and trade. But perhaps most importantly, the environmental diversity of pre-bottleneck Africa was stable enough to be predictable, yet variable enough to reward flexibility. Rainy seasons came reliably, but their intensity varied. Animal migrations followed patterns, but the exact timing shifted. This created selection pressure for humans who could adapt, who could adjust their strategies based on changing conditions, but who didn't face such extreme variability that long-term planning was impossible. This was the perfect environment for human cognitive evolution. Challenging enough to reward intelligence and innovation, stable enough to allow accumulation of knowledge across generations, complex enough to favour social cooperation and communication, predictable enough that cooperation paid off reliably. The population dynamics during this period were probably fluctuating but generally growing. Not explosive growth, but steady expansion. Groups would split when they got too large, sending off daughter populations to establish new territories. These splits maintained genetic connection. Members of different groups would have known they were related, would have maintained kinship ties, probably engaged in regular exchange of marriage partners. Different populations were developing their own cultural traditions, not different enough to prevent interbreeding or communication, but distinct enough that archaeologists can identify different tool-making traditions in different regions. The East African populations made tools one way. Southern African groups used slightly different techniques. These traditions persisted for thousands of years, passed down through generations. This cultural continuity tells us something profound. These groups were stable. They weren't nomads wandering randomly. They occupied specific territories for long enough that distinct traditions could develop and be maintained. They had home ranges, places they knew intimately. The location of water sources, the migration patterns of game, the fruiting seasons of plants, the best stone for tool making. And they were beginning to modify their environments in subtle but important ways, using fire to clear vegetation, creating more edge habitat where game was easier to hunt, selectively harvesting plants in ways that encouraged their growth. Not agriculture, not yet, but proto-management of resources, the first hints of the active environmental shaping that would eventually become humanity's defining characteristic. Life wasn't easy. Infant mortality was probably high. Life expectancy short by modern standards. Injuries, diseases, predators, violence between groups all took their toll. But populations were stable or growing, which means births exceeded deaths over time. The human experiment was succeeding. And then there was trade, not markets, not formalized exchange systems, but definitely movement of goods across long distances. Stone from specific quarries shows up hundreds of miles away at archaeological sites. This means either the same groups travelled enormous distances, or more likely materials were passing from group to group through exchange networks. Shell beads from the coast found inland, highland obsidian in lowland sites. These exchange relationships were probably social as much as economic. Marriages between groups, gift exchanges to cement alliances, visits for ceremonies or celebrations. The movement of goods was really the movement of relationships, the social networks that bound different populations together, even when they occupied territories hundreds of miles apart. The cognitive abilities required for this level of social complexity are staggering. You need to remember kinship relationships across multiple generations, track obligations and debts, negotiate agreements, maintain alliances with groups you might not see for years at a time, distinguish between friends and potential threats, all while dealing with the immediate challenges of survival. This was humanity's world 200,000 years ago. Diverse, dynamic, expanding. Multiple populations with distinct identities but shared ancestry. Sophisticated tool users, effective hunters, creative problem solvers. They had fire and language, cooperation and culture. They were spreading across Africa, adapting to every environment the continent offered. The future looked bright. Population growth seemed sustainable. The climate was supportive. New technologies were being developed. Cultural knowledge was accumulating. There was no reason to think this success wouldn't continue, that humanity wouldn't keep expanding and diversifying. But something was coming. Something no amount of intelligence or cooperation or technological sophistication could prevent. The African climate, which had been so generous for so long, was about to turn hostile in ways early humans could never have imagined. The stage was set. Humanity was thriving, diverse, genetically rich, culturally sophisticated. They had all the tools and knowledge their ancestors had accumulated over millions of years of evolution. They were about to need every bit of it, because the world they knew, the generous Africa that had nurtured humanity's first steps, was about to disappear. So what actually happened? What could bring humanity to the edge of extinction, reducing our entire species to just over 1,000 breeding individuals scattered across Africa? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you might imagine. It wasn't war, it wasn't disease, it wasn't some alien invasion or cosmic catastrophe. It was the planet itself turning against us in the most violent way imaginable. Around 74,000 years ago, in what is now Indonesia, a mountain exploded. But this wasn't just any volcanic eruption. This was Toba, a supervolcano, and when it erupted it released an amount of energy equivalent to several million nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. In a single geological instant, it became the largest volcanic event Earth had witnessed in over 2 million years. Mount Toba ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and volcanic material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that's enough material to bury the entire state of Texas under 3 feet of volcanic debris. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, an event that seemed apocalyptic at the time, it ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. The initial blast would have been visible from space, a column of superheated gas and pulverized rock shooting 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. Everything within 100 kilometers of the eruption was simply vaporized. Forests, animals, any early humans unfortunate enough to be in the region, all gone in seconds. Pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas and rock fragments travelling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, scoured the landscape clean for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. But the initial explosion, as devastating as it was, wasn't the real killer. The real catastrophe came from what happened next. All that volcanic material shot into the stratosphere didn't just fall back down. The finest particles, microscopic fragments of rock and sulfur dioxide gas, spread around the entire planet within weeks, carried by high-altitude winds. They formed a thick blanket in the upper atmosphere, a veil of volcanic aerosols that blocked sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. Within months, global temperatures plummeted. Not gradually over centuries like normal climate change, but catastrophically fast. Studies of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show temperature drops of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius globally, with some regions experiencing declines of 10 degrees or more. That might not sound like much, but consider that the difference between our current climate and the depth of the last ice age is only about 5 degrees Celsius globally. Toba created ice age conditions in a matter of months. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter, and it lasted not for months but for years, possibly decades. Imagine the sun rising every morning as a dim, blood-red disk barely visible through a grey haze. The sky would have had an eerie twilight quality even at midday. Temperatures that had been tropical or subtropical across much of Africa suddenly dropped to near freezing at night. Rainfall patterns collapsed as the disrupted atmosphere struggled to circulate moisture. Droughts began in some regions, while others experienced strange, out-of-season cold rains. The ecological impacts cascaded with devastating speed. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. With sunlight reduced by 30 to 50%, plant growth across the planet slowed dramatically. Tropical forests, which had covered much of Africa, began to die back. Grasslands that our ancestors had relied on for generations turned brown and sparse. Trees that normally fruited several times a year produced nothing, or produced fruit that was small and nutritionally poor. The herbivores that depended on these plants began to starve. Antelope populations crashed. Elephants and other megafauna, which require enormous amounts of plant matter daily, died in massive numbers. The archaeological record from this period shows a sudden disappearance of large animal bones from many sites. The megafauna that our ancestors had hunted and scavenged simply vanished from vast regions of Africa. And when the herbivores died, the carnivores followed. Lions, leopards, hyenas, all competing for the same shrinking pools of prey. For early humans, who were also trying to hunt and scavenge in this collapsing ecosystem, every meal became a desperate struggle, not just against hunger, but against other predators who were just as desperate and just as dangerous. But here's what makes the Toba hypothesis so compelling and so terrifying. The genetic evidence for the human bottleneck lines up almost perfectly with the timeline of the eruption. Those 117,000 years of reduced population that geneticists have identified, they begin right around the time Toba erupted. Volcanic ash from Toba has been found in sediment cores from lakes across Africa, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. It's a time marker, a geological timestamp that lets scientists correlate climate events across vast distances, and everywhere they find significant Toba ash deposits, they also find evidence of severe ecological disruption. Plant species disappear from the fossil record, animal populations crash. Archaeological sites show dramatic changes in human behavior and technology. In some regions of Africa, there are no human archaeological sites at all for thousands of years after Toba. The areas that had been continuously occupied for hundreds of thousands of years were simply abandoned. Either the people there died out completely, or they were forced to migrate to more survivable regions, leaving vast territories empty. But the volcanic winter was just the beginning. Even after the ash began to settle and sunlight levels started to recover, the planet didn't simply bounce back to normal. The Toba eruption had triggered a cascade of feedback effects that would keep the climate destabilized for over 100,000 years. The rapid cooling had caused massive expansion of ice sheets at the poles and on mountain ranges. These ice sheets, bright white and reflective, bounced more sunlight back into space, a process called the albedo effect. This kept temperatures depressed even after the volcanic aerosols had settled out. More ice led to more cooling, which led to more ice, a positive feedback loop that pushed Earth deeper into glacial conditions. Ocean currents, which regulate global climate by distributing heat from the equator toward the poles, began to shift in response to the changing temperatures. The circulation patterns that had remained stable for tens of thousands of years suddenly became chaotic. Some regions that had been warm and wet became cold and dry. Others experienced the opposite shift. Coastal areas where humans had established semi-permanent camps suddenly became uninhabitable as sea levels dropped, exposing new land but also eliminating productive estuaries and wetlands. Africa, which had been humanity's evolutionary home for millions of years, became a fragmented landscape of isolated refuges separated by expanding deserts and inhospitable climate zones. The Sahara, which during warm periods could support scattered human populations, expanded dramatically. What had been savannas and woodlands turned to dust and sand. Lake levels dropped. Rivers dried up or became seasonal. Water sources that had supported human bands for generations simply disappeared. The genetic evidence suggests that during the worst of this crisis, human populations became isolated from each other in small pockets of relatively survivable habitat. Coastal refuges where marine resources could supplement terrestrial food sources. Highland areas where altitude created microclimates different from the surrounding lowlands. River valleys in mountainous regions where water remained available even as surrounding areas dried out. These isolated populations couldn't trade genes frequently enough to maintain genetic diversity across the species. This is how bottlenecks work. You don't need every single human to die. You just need populations to become small enough and isolated enough that genetic drift becomes more powerful than gene flow. Random chance starts determining which genetic variants survive and which disappear. Rare alleles that might have been beneficial get lost simply because the individuals carrying them didn't reproduce, or their offspring didn't survive. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, but what exists tells a story of incredible hardship. Stone tools become cruder, simpler, not because people forgot how to make good tools, but because they didn't have time or resources for careful craftsmanship. When you're starving, you grab whatever rock is available and chip it into something that can cut or scrape. You don't spend hours creating the perfect hand axe. Sites from this period show evidence of what archaeologists call opportunistic behavior. People eating foods they would normally avoid, shellfish species that are difficult to process, small mammals that provide minimal calories for the effort of hunting them, plant foods that require extensive preparation to remove toxins. This is the signature of populations on the edge. When you're desperate, you eat anything that won't immediately kill you. There's also evidence of increased violence. Skeletal remains from this period show more healed fractures, more signs of trauma, more injuries consistent with interpersonal conflict. When resources become scarce, human groups compete more intensely. Not because people suddenly become more violent, but because the stakes of every encounter increase. That waterhole or hunting territory that your band needs for survival, another group needs it just as badly. Someone is going home empty-handed, and empty-handed means death. But here's where the story gets more complicated, because not all scientists agree that Toba was the primary driver of the human bottleneck. The volcanic winter hypothesis is compelling, but it's not the only explanation for what nearly killed us all. Some researchers point out that the climate was already deteriorating before Toba erupted. Ice cores from Antarctica show that Earth was entering a particularly severe glacial period around 75,000 years ago, independent of any volcanic activity. Temperatures were dropping, ice sheets were expanding, Africa was drying out. Toba might have just been the final push over the edge of a crisis that was already building. Others argue for what's called the long drought hypothesis. Genetic analysis suggests the bottleneck lasted not just a few decades or centuries, but over 100,000 years. That's too long for a volcanic winter alone to explain. Instead, some scientists propose that Africa experienced an extended period of extreme aridity, a mega drought that lasted tens of thousands of years. Sediment cores from African lakes show evidence of dramatically reduced water levels during this period. Some lakes that are large and deep today were completely dry or reduced to small, salty puddles. In this scenario, human populations didn't crash all at once. Instead, they declined gradually over thousands of years as habitable territory slowly shrank. Generation by generation, the areas where humans could survive grew smaller. Populations that had numbered in the hundreds or thousands dwindled to dozens. Groups that had been connected by trade and interbreeding became isolated. The genetic bottleneck wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a slow grinding attrition that lasted longer than recorded human history. There's also a third possibility, one that's perhaps most terrifying because it suggests we faced not one disaster, but multiple simultaneous crises. What if Toba erupted during a period when climate was already deteriorating and Africa was already experiencing severe drought? What if the volcanic winter hit human populations that were already stressed, already struggling, already on the edge of collapse? This is what scientists call a perfect storm scenario. Multiple stressors combining in ways that amplify each other's effects. A population that might have survived the volcanic winter alone, or the drought alone, or the advancing ice sheets alone, gets hit by all three simultaneously and nearly goes extinct. The genetic evidence actually supports this interpretation. The bottleneck wasn't a sharp spike of mortality followed by quick recovery. The genetic data suggests a prolonged period of very small population size with multiple crisis points over tens of thousands of years. This looks less like a single catastrophic event and more like a sustained environmental catastrophe that kept knocking humanity down every time we tried to recover. Climate proxies from this period show incredible instability. In ice cores and lake sediments, scientists can see rapid shifts between different climate states. Decade-long droughts followed by periods of slightly better conditions, then drought again. Cold periods where temperatures dropped dramatically, followed by brief warm spells, then more cold. This kind of climate chaos would have been devastating for any species trying to adapt and survive. For humans, who are dependent on complex ecosystems for food, water and shelter, this instability meant that no survival strategy could remain effective for long. You figure out how to exploit a particular resource, and within a generation that resource disappears, you move your band to a more favourable area, and a decade later the climate shifts and that area becomes uninhabitable. You can't build up reserves, you can't establish stable territories, you're always on the move, always adapting, always one bad season away from starvation. The geographic distribution of the crisis adds another layer to the story. Genetic analysis suggests that the human populations that survived the bottleneck were primarily in eastern and southern Africa. These regions seem to have maintained pockets of survivable habitat even during the worst of the crisis. Coastal areas of South Africa, where rocky shorelines provided reliable access to shellfish and other marine resources. Highland regions of East Africa, where altitude created microclimates different from the surrounding lowlands. River valleys that maintained water flow even as surrounding areas dried out. But these refuges were small and widely separated. A human band surviving in a coastal refuge in South Africa might have been completely isolated from groups surviving in East African highlands. No trade, no gene flow, no exchange of innovations or techniques. For thousands of years, these isolated populations evolved semi-independently, accumulating slightly different genetic variants, developing slightly different tools and survival strategies. The fact that humanity survived at all during this period is remarkable. The fact that we remained a single species, capable of interbreeding when populations eventually reconnected, is even more remarkable. Most species faced with this kind of fragmentation and isolation would have split into multiple daughter species, each adapted to their particular refuge environment. But humans didn't split. We remained unified enough genetically that when the climate finally began to recover and populations could expand and reconnect, we were still all the same species. This suggests that either the isolation wasn't complete, that somehow small amounts of gene flow continued between refuges, or that the bottleneck, while severe, wasn't long enough for complete reproductive isolation to develop. Recent genetic studies have added more details to this picture. they suggest that during the worst of the bottleneck, there may have been as few as 640 breeding pairs of humans, around 1,280 individuals total. That's the entire global human population. Fewer people than currently live in a small village, spread across multiple isolated refuges in Africa. Each refuge probably contained no more than a few dozen individuals, extended family groups of 30 to 50 people, struggling to find food, maintain tools, care for children, and somehow pass on the knowledge and skills necessary for survival. Think about what that means. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from that tiny group. Every bit of genetic diversity our species possesses, every variant that helps us resist disease or process different foods or adapt to different climates, all of it had to be present in those 280 individuals. Anything that wasn't in their genomes was lost forever. This is why human genetic diversity is so low compared to other great apes. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have about 4 times more genetic diversity than humans, even though their current population is only a few 100,000. Gorillas, with population numbers in the tens of thousands, have more genetic diversity than we do. We went through a genetic filter so narrow that it stripped away most of the variation our ancestors had accumulated over millions of years of evolution. But here's the paradox. That same bottleneck that reduced our genetic diversity also made us who we are today. The individuals who survived weren't random. Natural selection during this period was intense, brutal, unforgiving. Any trait that slightly reduced your chances of survival meant your genes didn't make it through the filter. Any trait that slightly improved your survival chances meant you were more likely to be among the ancestors of all future humans. The catastrophe wasn't just killing people. It was sculpting our species, selecting for very specific traits that would determine the future course of human evolution. Intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, resilience. These weren't just nice to have during the crisis. They were the difference between extinction and survival, between leaving descendants and having your genetic line end forever. So what nearly killed us all? Was it Toba, the supervolcano that darkened the skies and froze the planet? Was it the long drought that turned Africa into a fragmented landscape of isolated refuges? Was it the advance of ice sheets and the chaos of rapidly shifting climate? Or was it all of these things combined? A perfect storm of catastrophes that hit an already vulnerable species at exactly the wrong time? The answer is probably yes to all of the above. The evidence suggests we faced multiple overlapping crises over a period of more than 100,000 years. Single disasters that might have been survivable became nearly fatal when combined. Climate shifts that might have been manageable became devastating because they came one after another with no time for recovery in between. But we survived. Against odds that seem impossible in retrospect, those 1,280 individuals held on. They adapted, they innovated, they passed on their knowledge and their genes, and eventually, when the climate finally began to stabilize and recover, their descendants would spread across the world and become the dominant species on the planet. But that survival, that recovery, would take another 70,000 years of struggle, and it would transform humanity in ways that the survivors of the catastrophe could never have imagined. Here's the remarkable thing about nearly going extinct. It leaves scars. Not physical scars that you can see in the archaeological record, but genetic ones. Tiny, molecular signatures written into the very structure of our DNA. And for decades, scientists had no idea these scars existed. They had no clue that humanity had come within a hair's breadth of total annihilation. Then, in the late 20th century, researchers started looking at human genetics in a completely new way. And what they found was absolutely shocking. It started with a woman. Not a real woman, but a theoretical one that scientists called mitochondrial Eve. Now, before you get excited, this wasn't the biblical Eve. This wasn't the first woman ever to exist. She was something far more interesting and far more scientifically significant. She was the most recent common ancestor of all humans alive today, traced through an unbroken maternal line. Let me explain how this works, because it's actually beautifully simple. Inside every cell in your body, floating around outside the nucleus, are tiny structures called mitochondria. These are the powerhouses of the cell, the little organelles that convert nutrients into energy. But here's the fascinating part. Mitochondria have their own DNA, completely separate from the DNA in your cell nucleus. And mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is only passed down from mothers to children. Your father's mitochondria don't make it into the fertilized egg. They're filtered out. So every single person alive today carries mtDNA that came exclusively from their mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, stretching back in an unbroken chain through countless generations. In the 1980s, a team of researchers led by Alan Wilson at UC Berkeley had a brilliant idea. What if we could trace these maternal lineages backward through time by comparing mtDNA from people all over the world? If we could map out all the mutations, all the tiny genetic changes that had accumulated over thousands of generations, we could construct a family tree for all of humanity. We could literally trace every person alive back to their common maternal ancestor. So they started collecting DNA samples from Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas, Oceania. Everywhere humans lived, they gathered genetic material. Then they started comparing sequences, looking for patterns, tracking mutations, and the results were stunning. When they published their findings in 1987, it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Every human alive could trace their maternal lineage back to a single woman who lived in Africa somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. But here's what really caught scientists' attention. The genetic diversity was incredibly low, far lower than it should be for a species as widespread and numerous as humans. When they compared human mtDNA diversity to that of other great apes, something was clearly wrong. Chimpanzees, who live only in equatorial Africa and number far fewer individuals than humans, had 3 to 4 times more genetic diversity. Gorillas had even more. It was as if humanity had gone through some kind of catastrophic collapse, as if our population had shrunk to an impossibly small number at some point in the past, creating a genetic bottleneck that stripped away most of our diversity. Then, in the 1990s, researchers started looking at Y chromosome DNA. This is the mirror image of mitochondrial DNA analysis. The Y chromosome is passed exclusively from fathers to sons, creating unbroken paternal lineages stretching back through time. If mtDNA could trace maternal ancestry, Y DNA could trace paternal ancestry. And if both showed the same patterns, if both indicated a dramatic population bottleneck, that would be powerful confirming evidence. The Y chromosome studies revealed something researchers called Y chromosomal Adam. Again, not the biblical figure, but the most recent common male ancestor of all humans alive today. And just like with mitochondrial Eve, the genetic diversity was shockingly low. Every man alive today, from Iceland to Indonesia, carries Y chromosome DNA that traces back to a single male ancestor who lived in Africa between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. But Y chromosomal Adam didn't live at the same time as mitochondrial Eve. They weren't a couple. They probably never met. They lived tens of thousands of years apart. What they represented were convergence points in human ancestry, the individuals through whom all modern human lineages eventually passed. And the fact that both maternal and paternal lineages showed such dramatic restrictions in genetic diversity. That pointed to something massive. something that had reduced the human population to a tiny remnant. Now, genetic diversity isn't just about having lots of different DNA sequences. It's about variation at specific locations in the genome called genetic markers. Every time DNA replicates, there's a tiny chance of mutation. A single letter in the genetic code might change from an A to a G or a C to a T. Most of these mutations are completely harmless. They don't change how proteins function or affect survival in any way. They just sit there in the genome, generation after generation, accumulating like rings in a tree trunk. In a large, stable population, you get lots of these neutral mutations scattered across many different individuals. The genetic diversity stays high because mutations arising in different family lines are preserved. But in a small population, especially one that stays small for a long time, something different happens. Mutations get lost. When only a handful of individuals survive to reproduce, many genetic lineages simply disappear. The mutations those lineages carried vanish from the gene pool forever. What's left is a homogenized population, where everyone carries very similar DNA because they all descended from the same small group of survivors. This is exactly what geneticists found when they started looking at human DNA in detail. Compared to other primates, compared to most mammals, compared to virtually any other species with a similar geographic range, humans were genetically monotonous. We were like crops that had been selectively bred for generations, all descended from a small founding population, all carrying remarkably similar genetic material. But here's where it gets really interesting. Scientists can actually calculate how small a population must have been based on genetic diversity. It's a field called coalescent theory, and it uses mathematical models to work backward from current genetic patterns to infer past population sizes. The calculations are complex, involving mutation rates, generation times, and statistical analysis of how genetic variants are distributed across populations. But the basic principle is simple. The less diversity you see, the smaller the ancestral population must have been. In 1995, a team of researchers used these techniques to estimate the effective population size of humans during the bottleneck period. The number they came up with was shocking, about 10,000 individuals. That's not the total human population, but the effective breeding population. The number of individuals who were actually contributing to the gene pool of future generations. The actual total population might have been larger, maybe 30,000 to 50,000 people, but only a fraction were surviving to reproductive age and successfully passing on their genes. Then, as genetic sequencing technology improved, the estimates got even more precise and even more alarming. Studies published in the early 2000s using more sophisticated techniques suggested the bottleneck might have been even more severe. Some analyses indicated effective population sizes as low as 2,000 individuals. One study from 2003 suggested the breeding population might have dropped below 1 or 500 for a period of time. But the real breakthrough came with whole genome sequencing. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers could only look at small pieces of DNA, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, maybe a few other genetic markers scattered across the genome. But starting in the 2000s, technology advanced to the point where scientists could sequence entire genomes, all 3 billion base pairs of human DNA, and they could do it for hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of individuals from populations all over the world. This created an unprecedented view into human genetic history. Instead of just looking at a few markers, researchers could examine hundreds of thousands of genetic variants simultaneously. They could track not just single lineages, but whole networks of ancestry. They could identify ancient population movements, interbreeding events, and most importantly, they could detect bottlenecks with far greater precision. One landmark study published in 2008 analysed genome-wide data from nearly 1,000 individuals representing 51 different populations from around the world. The researchers used advanced statistical techniques to model human population history over the past million years. What found confirmed and extended earlier results. There had definitely been a severe population bottleneck. But it wasn't just one event. The data suggested multiple bottlenecks occurring at different times and affecting different populations. The most severe bottleneck appeared to have occurred between 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, right in the middle of that devastating climate catastrophe we discussed earlier. During this period, the effective population size of our ancestors crashed to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals, and it stayed that low not for a few generations, but for over 100,000 years. That's 5,000 generations of humans living on the edge of extinction. 5,000 generations during which a single disease outbreak, a single drought, a single volcanic eruption could have ended our lineage forever. But different genetic markers showed different patterns. Some suggested additional bottlenecks around 200,000 years ago, and again around 70,000 years ago. This made sense given what we know about climate history. The planet had multiple periods of extreme climate instability. Each one would have hammered human populations, reducing our numbers and stripping away genetic diversity. The 70,000-year bottleneck was particularly interesting because it coincided with the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 2 million years. It ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it caused a volcanic winter lasting 6 to 10 years. Global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, they fell even further. Genetic evidence suggested human populations crashed during this period, possibly dropping to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. But as more data accumulated, scientists started debating the details. Not everyone agreed on the severity or timing of the bottlenecks. Some researchers argued the genetic evidence could be explained by population structure rather than dramatic crashes. If early humans lived in small, semi-isolated groups that rarely interbred, that could create genetic patterns that looked like bottlenecks, even if the total population remained relatively stable. Others pointed out that different parts of the genome told slightly different stories. Nuclear DNA suggested one pattern. Mitochondrial DNA suggested another. Y chromosome DNA suggested yet another. This wasn't necessarily contradictory. Different genetic systems evolve at different rates and respond to different selection pressures. But it made calculating precise population sizes and bottleneck timings much more complicated than early researchers had assumed. One major controversy emerged around the question of whether there was a single bottleneck or multiple regional bottlenecks. Some geneticists argued that the data was consistent with a severe Pan-African collapse affecting all human populations simultaneously. Others suggested different groups in different parts of Africa experienced separate bottlenecks at different times. A drought might devastate populations in East Africa, while groups in South Africa remained stable. Then conditions would reverse, with southern populations crashing while eastern ones recovered. A 2019 study using advanced computational methods suggested the truth might be somewhere in between. The researchers analysed genetic data from over 3,000 individuals and built highly detailed models of human population history. Their results indicated a complex pattern of interconnected bottlenecks. There had been an overall reduction in human population size during the climate catastrophe, 900,000 to 600,000 years ago. But within this larger pattern, different regional populations experienced their own local crashes and recoveries. Some groups were hit harder than others, some recovered faster, and crucially, there was enough gene flow between groups to prevent complete isolation, but not enough to eliminate the bottleneck signatures. The most sophisticated analyses to date, published in 2023, used machine learning algorithms to sift through genomic data from over 10,000 individuals. These studies confirmed that humans went through at least one severe bottleneck where the global effective population size dropped below 2,000 individuals. The timing was pushed back even earlier, to around 930,000 years ago, and the duration was estimated at 117,000 years. During this period, our ancestors teetered on the brink. The genetic diversity that exists in humans today, all the variation in height, skin color, disease resistance, everything that makes us different from each other, traces back to this tiny population of survivors. But perhaps the most remarkable genetic evidence came from an unexpected source: chromosomal fusion. Remember those 46 chromosomes that humans have instead of the 48 that chimpanzees and other great apes have? In 2005, researchers definitively proved that human chromosome 2 is the result of two ancestral chromosomes fusing together. You can still see the remnants of the original chromosomes. The telomeres, normally found only at the ends of chromosomes, appear in the middle of chromosome 2. The centromeres, the attachment points that cells use to separate chromosomes during division, also show a duplicated pattern. This fusion event happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms, probably within the past million years. And here's what makes it relevant to the bottleneck story. A chromosomal fusion like this should be evolutionarily disadvantageous, at least initially. Individuals carrying it would have difficulty reproducing with individuals who didn't. Their offspring might have fertility problems or developmental issues. Under normal circumstances, a mutation like this should disappear from the population within a few generations. But if the population crashes to a tiny size, strange things can happen. Rare mutations can become fixed in the population simply because everyone is related to everyone else. There's nowhere for the mutation to be diluted or bred out. If one of those 280 bottleneck survivors happen to carry the fused chromosome, and if their descendants happen to be among the few who made it through the crisis, suddenly you've got an entire species carrying what should have been an evolutionary dead end. The chromosomal fusion is like a genetic timestamp marking the bottleneck. It's proof that at some point, human population structure became so constrained that a major chromosomal rearrangement could sweep through the entire species. This kind of genetic revolution only happens in very small populations under extreme selection pressure. Modern genetic analysis has also revealed something else fascinating. The bottleneck didn't affect all genes equally. Some parts of the genome show evidence of intense natural selection during the crisis period. Genes related to brain development, immune function, and stress response show signatures of what geneticists call positive selection. These are regions where beneficial mutations spread rapidly through the population because they provided significant survival advantages. Other parts of the genome show evidence of relaxed selection or even random genetic drift. These are regions where mutations accumulated without providing any particular advantage or disadvantage. The population was so small that random chance played a bigger role than natural selection in determining which genetic variants survived. The overall picture that emerges from genetic evidence is one of a species pushed to the absolute limit of survival and transformed by the experience. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't the same as the ones who entered it. They carried less genetic diversity, but that diversity had been refined by the most intense natural selection event in human history. They carried a fused chromosome that marked them forever as bottleneck survivors. They carried genes that had been selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. And all of this was written into their DNA, passed down through countless generations, still readable today by scientists with the right tools and techniques. Every person alive carries this genetic evidence. Every human genome tells the same story of survival against impossible odds. We're all descendants of those 2080 individuals who refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. The genetic evidence doesn't just tell us what happened, it tells us how close we came to never existing at all. And it reminds us that we're all related in the most literal sense possible. Every human on Earth is your cousin, separated by at most a few thousand generations. We all trace back to the same tiny group of survivors who made it through humanity's darkest hour. That genetic unity, that shared heritage of survival, is written into every cell of your body. And now, thanks to modern science, we can finally read the story it's been telling all along. 1,280 people. That's all that was left, scattered across a continent that had become a maze of death zones and shrinking refuges. The climate was still catastrophic. Food was scarce. Every day was a struggle just to see the next sunrise. By all rights, we should have died out completely. So how did we survive? The answer lies in a handful of refuge areas in Africa, where conditions, while terrible, weren't quite impossible. These were the islands of habitability in a sea of extinction, the places where that remnant population clung to life while the rest of the continent burned, froze, or simply dried up into uninhabitable wasteland. Scientists have identified several likely refuge zones based on genetic, archaeological, and paleoclimatic evidence. The most important was probably along the southern coast of Africa, in what is now South Africa. This region had something the rest of the continent was losing: reliable water. Cave systems near the coast maintained freshwater springs even during the worst droughts. The ocean provided a buffer against the most extreme temperature fluctuations, and most crucially, the shoreline offered food resources that didn't depend on the collapse in terrestrial ecosystems. The second major refuge was likely in the Ethiopian highlands. High-altitude areas maintained different climate patterns than the surrounding lowlands. When the plains became uninhabitable desert, the mountains caught just enough precipitation to sustain small pockets of vegetation. Rivers originating in the highlands continued flowing even when surrounding regions dried completely. It was marginal, barely enough to survive on, but it was something. There may have been other refuges too, perhaps in the dense forests of Central Africa, where tree cover created microclimates that resisted the worst of the climate chaos. Possibly around the Great Lakes of East Africa, where large bodies of water moderated local conditions. We'll probably never know exactly how many separate populations survived or where all of them were located, but we know they were small, isolated, and facing conditions that pushed them to the absolute limits of what humans could endure. Living in these refuges wasn't just about being in the right place. It was about having the right behaviors, the right innovations, the right social structures to maximize every possible advantage. And this is where something remarkable happened. The crisis didn't just kill off most of humanity. It transformed the survivors into something unprecedented in evolutionary history. Think about the selection pressure. Every individual who survived to reproduce had to be not just lucky, but extraordinarily capable. They had to be smart enough to solve novel problems, cooperative enough to work effectively in groups, innovative enough to develop new survival strategies when old ones failed, and flexible enough to adapt when conditions changed, which they did constantly. This wasn't natural selection acting slowly over millions of years. This was natural selection on fast forward. Any genetic variant that improved survival, even slightly, would spread rapidly through the small population. Any behavior that increased chances of having children who survived to adulthood would be preserved and passed down. Over 117,000 years, this created what biologists call a strong selection bottleneck. Not just reducing population size, but fundamentally reshaping what it meant to be human. The most important adaptation was probably cognitive. Human brains were already large before the bottleneck. We were already capable of complex thought. but the crisis selected for specific types of intelligence that would prove revolutionary: problem-solving ability, the capacity to look at a new challenge and figure out a solution without having seen anyone else solve it first. In stable times, you could survive by learning from others, doing what your parents and grandparents did. But during the bottleneck, traditional knowledge often didn't work anymore. The old hunting grounds were gone. The old food sources had disappeared. The old seasonal patterns no longer applied. Survivors needed to be able to think their way through unprecedented problems. How do you find food when every animal you know how to hunt has migrated away or gone extinct? How do you stay warm when the temperature drops lower than anyone in living memory has experienced? How do you find water when every traditional source has dried up? The individuals who could answer these questions through pure reasoning and experimentation were the ones who survived. The ones who couldn't, didn't. Archaeological evidence from this period shows exactly this kind of innovation in action. Stone tools start showing greater sophistication and more specialized designs. Not just generic choppers that could be used for everything, but carefully crafted implements designed for specific tasks. Scrapers with precisely shaped edges for processing hides. Points with optimized weight and balance for throwing. Cutting tools that maintained sharp edges longer. This tells us something profound. Toolmakers were thinking ahead, planning for future needs, understanding abstract concepts like efficiency and specialization. They were developing what cognitive scientists call executive function, the ability to set goals, make plans, and execute complex sequences of actions to achieve desired outcomes. But individual intelligence only gets you so far. The real key to survival was social. Humans are cooperative by nature, but the bottleneck turned cooperation from an advantage into an absolute necessity. No individual or even single family could survive alone. The environment was too harsh, resources too scarce, challenges too varied. Survivors had to work together in ways that went far beyond anything their ancestors had achieved. They needed to share food even when it meant going hungry themselves because today's giver might be tomorrow's receiver. They needed to share knowledge because a technique that saved one person's life might save everyone's life eventually. They needed to share childcare because every child who survived to adulthood increased the group's chances of long-term survival. The genetic evidence shows exactly this kind of social cooperation at work. Despite being scattered across multiple refuge areas with limited contact, the surviving populations show remarkably low genetic diversity. This suggests something extraordinary was happening. Groups weren't just surviving in isolation, they were maintaining connections across vast distances, probably through periodic meetings at seasonal gathering places. They were exchanging members to prevent inbreeding. They were sharing information about resources and dangers. They were creating social networks that functioned like a distributed survival system. If one group's territory became uninhabitable, they could be absorbed into another group. If one population discovered a new food source or survival technique, the knowledge could spread to other populations. This wasn't just cooperation within groups. This was cooperation between groups, something rarely seen in nature and absolutely unprecedented among primates. Creating and maintaining these networks required sophisticated communication abilities. You can't negotiate alliances or share complex information with just grunts and gestures. The bottleneck period almost certainly saw major advances in human language capabilities. Not necessarily modern language as we know it, but something far more sophisticated than earlier humans had possessed. Individuals who could communicate more precisely, understand more complex instructions, or convey subtle information more effectively would have had massive survival advantages. They could coordinate hunts better. They could teach skills more efficiently. They could maintain relationships across distances. Over thousands of generations, this selection pressure refined human communication into something truly powerful. But social cooperation and communication only matter if you have something worth communicating about. And this is where another crucial survival strategy comes in: technological innovation. The survivors weren't just using the tools and techniques their ancestors had developed, they were inventing new ones at an unprecedented rate. The most important innovation was probably the systematic exploitation of coastal resources. Remember those refugee areas along the southern African coast? The survivors didn't just camp near the ocean because it was pretty. They figured out how to use it. Archaeological sites from this period show the first systematic evidence of marine resource exploitation. Shell middens, accumulations of discarded seashells that indicate regular harvesting of shellfish. Fish, bones showing evidence of processing and consumption. Even primitive fish hooks and net weights that suggest sophisticated fishing techniques. This was revolutionary. Terrestrial food sources were collapsing under the climate pressure. Most of the large herbivores that humans traditionally hunted were dying out or migrating away. Plant foods were becoming scarcer as vegetation patterns changed. But the ocean was different. Marine ecosystems were affected by the climate catastrophe, but they remained productive. Shellfish in tidal pools, fish in coastal waters, seaweed and other marine plants. These represented a food source that didn't depend on the collapsing terrestrial ecosystems. Learning to exploit these resources required major cognitive and technological leaps. You have to understand tides, knowing when shores would be accessible and where different species could be found. You have to develop new gathering techniques, different from anything used for hunting land animals. You have to figure out how to process foods that earlier humans had probably never eaten, removing shells, dealing with toxins in certain species, preparing foods that were safe to eat. The genetic evidence supports this coastal adaptation theory. Humans show several genetic variants that help process seafood more efficiently, variants that appear to have been selected for during the bottleneck period. We developed better abilities to metabolize omega-3 fatty acids found in fish, better resistance to certain marine toxins, genetic changes that suggest our ancestors were eating significant amounts of seafood for tens of thousands of years. But coastal resources alone weren't enough. Survivors also needed to make the most of whatever terrestrial resources remained, and this meant becoming incredibly efficient hunters and gatherers. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing sophistication in hunting technology. Spear points become more carefully crafted and standardized, suggesting systematic production techniques rather than ad hoc tool-making. The placement of archaeological sites tells another story. Survivors were choosing camp locations with incredible strategic precision. Not just any cave or rock shelter, but specific sites that offered multiple advantages. Proximity to water sources, good visibility for spotting approaching dangers or potential prey, access to multiple ecological zones within a reasonable distance, coastal areas, inland valleys, forested regions, protection from the worst weather, easy defensibility if needed. These weren't random choices. They were the result of careful planning and accumulated knowledge. Groups were thinking systematically about how to maximize their survival chances. Where should we camp to have access to the most resources? How do we position ourselves to respond quickly if conditions change? What backup locations should we identify in case we need to move quickly? This kind of strategic thinking required mental abilities that earlier humans may not have fully possessed. The capacity for spatial reasoning, understanding how different locations related to each other and to available resources. Temporal planning, thinking weeks or months ahead about seasonal changes and resource availability. Risk assessment, weighing different options and making choices that balanced short-term needs against long-term survival. But perhaps the most crucial survival technology was also the most basic: fire. Humans had controlled fire for hundreds of thousands of years before the bottleneck, but during the crisis, fire mastery became absolutely essential. Not just for cooking or scaring away predators, but for surviving the temperature extremes that made the bottleneck period so deadly. The climate wasn't just cold or hot, it was volatile. Temperatures could swing dramatically between day and night, between seasons, between years. In some refuge areas, survivors faced freezing nights even if days were tolerable. In others, the combination of extreme heat during the day and cold at night created thermal stress that could kill the unprepared. Fire provided thermal regulation. It allowed humans to survive in temperatures that would otherwise be fatal. But maintaining fire during the bottleneck period wasn't easy. In drought conditions, fuel could be scarce. During wet periods, keeping fire going required careful tending and protective shelter. Survivors had to become expert firekeepers, maintaining flames continuously, because the ability to create fire from scratch was still unreliable. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increasingly sophisticated fire management. Hearths aren't just randomly placed. They're carefully constructed with stone surrounds that reflect heat efficiently. They're positioned in caves and rock shelters to maximize warmth while minimizing smoke accumulation. Some sites show evidence of multiple hearths, suggesting backup systems in case one fire failed. There's even evidence of fire transport. Carefully selected wood that could hold embers for hours while groups moved between locations. This allowed populations to maintain continuous fire across migrations, reducing the risk of losing this crucial resource. Fire also enabled another critical survival strategy: food processing. Many plant foods that would otherwise be toxic or indigestible become edible when cooked. During the bottleneck, when traditional food sources were scarce, survivors couldn't afford to be picky. They needed to extract nutrition from whatever was available. Fire made that possible. Archaeological sites show processing of plant foods that modern humans rarely eat. Underground tubers, seeds from plants that are toxic when raw, even tree bark during the most desperate times. Clothing was another technology that took on new importance during the crisis. Earlier humans in Africa hadn't needed much clothing. The climate was generally warm and natural. Human body hair provided adequate insulation. But the temperature extremes of the bottleneck period changed that calculation. Genetic evidence suggests that clothing technology advanced significantly during this period. Humans lost most of our body hair, probably because wearing animal skins for insulation was more effective than natural fur in highly variable climates. You can put on clothing when it's cold and remove it when it's hot. You can't do that with body hair. The transition to clothing required multiple innovations: hunting or scavenging animals with suitable hides, developing techniques for removing skins without damaging them, treating hides so they remained flexible and didn't rot, creating fasteners or attachment methods to keep clothing in place. Each of these steps required problem-solving and experimentation. Survivors who figured out effective clothing techniques had better thermal regulation, which meant better energy efficiency, which meant better survival chances. Shelter technology also advanced dramatically. Natural caves and rock overhangs had always been used for temporary shelter. But during the bottleneck, survivors began modifying these spaces more systematically, building windbreaks at cave entrances to reduce heat loss, creating stone barriers to divide large caves into smaller spaces that were easier to heat, constructing sleeping platforms that elevated people off cold cave floors. Some sites show even more impressive modifications. At several South African coastal caves, archaeologists have found evidence of systematic organization of living space, distinct areas for different activities, tool-making zones near the best light, sleeping areas in the most protected locations, food processing areas near hearth sites. This kind of spatial organisation suggests complex social coordination and long-term occupation of preferred sites. But all these technologies, innovations and adaptations only worked because of one underlying factor: cognitive flexibility. The survivors weren't just doing one thing well. They were constantly adapting, trying new approaches, abandoning strategies that stopped working, and developing new ones when conditions changed. This flexibility shows up in the archaeological record as increasing diversity of tool types, evidence of using multiple food sources simultaneously, and willingness to occupy different types of environments. When one refuge area became unsustainable, survivors moved to another and quickly adapted to its specific challenges. When a traditional food source disappeared, they switched to alternatives without lengthy trial and error periods. This wasn't just behavioural flexibility, it was cognitive flexibility, the mental capacity to update your understanding of the world quickly when circumstances changed, to abandon assumptions that were no longer valid, to recognise patterns in new situations that resembled patterns from previous experiences, to transfer knowledge from one context to another. This kind of thinking is what cognitive scientists call fluid intelligence, and it's one of humanity's defining characteristics. The bottleneck didn't create it. Humans had always been adaptable, but it selected for it with unprecedented intensity. The survivors were the most mentally flexible individuals from the pre-bottleneck population. Their descendants inherited that flexibility, and it became part of the core human cognitive toolkit. By the end of those 117,000 years, the humans who had survived weren't just lucky. They were fundamentally different from their ancestors who had entered the bottleneck. Smarter, not just in terms of raw brain power, but in specific types of intelligence that enabled survival under extreme conditions. More cooperative, capable of maintaining social networks and sharing resources in ways earlier humans had never achieved. More innovative, constantly developing new technologies and techniques rather than relying solely on traditional knowledge, and more flexible, able to adapt quickly when circumstances changed, rather than being locked into rigid survival strategies. These survivors were the genetic and cultural ancestors of everyone alive today. Every human being carries the adaptations that allowed those 280 individuals to endure. Our capacity for complex language, our tendency towards social cooperation, our drive to innovate and create, our mental flexibility in facing new challenges. All of these trace back to that desperate period when survival required becoming something more than humans had ever been before. But survival was just the beginning. The population had stabilized at critically low levels, hanging on by the thinnest margin in their scattered refuges. The worst of the crisis was passing. The climate was beginning to stabilize, and humanity was about to do something that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the bottleneck. We were about to recover, to expand, to reclaim a continent and eventually a world. But that recovery would come with its own surprises, its own challenges, and consequences that are still shaping human evolution today. The crisis was over, but the world didn't suddenly become easy. Around 640,000 years ago, after 117,000 years of barely hanging on, something shifted. The climate began to stabilize. Not back to what it had been before, that world was gone forever, but into something more predictable, something humans could work with. The population that had bottomed out at perhaps our 280 breeding individuals began to grow. But this wasn't a rapid explosion. This was slow, careful, generational expansion. A population that had been selected for survival under the most extreme conditions wasn't going to take unnecessary risks now. The recovery took tens of thousands of years. By 600,000 years ago, the human population might have reached 10,000 individuals. Still dangerously small by any measure, Still vulnerable to localized disasters, a single volcanic eruption or extended drought could have wiped out regional populations that had taken millennia to establish. But they kept growing. 20,000 individuals, then 50,000, then 100,000. Each generation pushing a little further into territories that had been abandoned during the crisis. Each community relearning how to thrive rather than just survive. The genetic signature of this recovery is written in our DNA today. When population geneticists analyze modern human genomes, they can see the expansion pattern clearly. A long, slow increase in population size starting around 640,000 years ago, accelerating gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. But here's what makes this recovery remarkable. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't the same as the ones who went in. 117,000 years of the most intense natural selection in human history had fundamentally changed them. Not just genetically, though those changes were profound, but behaviorally, cognitively, culturally. They had become something new. The archaeological record from this period shows a clear break with what came before. Stone tools become more sophisticated, more standardized, more carefully planned. Before the bottleneck, human technology had been fairly static for hundreds of thousands of years. Simple choppers and hand axes that did the job well enough. After the bottleneck, innovation accelerates. New tool types appear every few thousand years instead of every few 100,000 years. This wasn't random. The bottleneck had selected for innovation. During those desperate millennia, the humans who survived were the ones who could solve problems creatively, who could look at a familiar challenge and come up with a new solution. That trait, once established, became part of the human behavioral toolkit. We stopped being creatures who did things the way they had always been done. We became creatures who constantly asked, what if we tried this differently? The evidence shows up in how tools were made. Pre-bottleneck hominins would find a useful rock shape and use it until it wore out. Post-bottleneck humans began modifying rocks systematically, planning several steps ahead to create specific tool shapes for specific purposes. They weren't just using what nature provided anymore. They were manufacturing solutions to problems. But the real breakthrough was cultural. Sometime during the recovery period, humans developed the ability to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations in increasingly sophisticated ways. Not just showing your children how to chip rocks, but teaching complex, multi-step processes, explaining why certain techniques worked better than others, creating what anthropologists call cultural ratcheting, where each generation builds on the innovations of the previous one instead of starting from scratch. The genetic bottleneck had made this possible by selecting for enhanced communication abilities. During the crisis, the humans who survived were those who could coordinate effectively with their groups, share information about resources and dangers, maintain social bonds that provided support during the hardest times. Over thousands of generations, these selection pressures had refined human communication far beyond anything seen in other species. By 500,000 years ago, humans were probably using sophisticated proto-language, not the fully modern speech we have today, but something far more advanced than simple alarm calls and social grunts. They could convey abstract concepts, talk about things that weren't immediately present, teach complex skills through verbal instruction. This communication revolution accelerated everything else. Technological innovation could spread rapidly between groups. Survival strategies that worked could be shared across hundreds of miles. Young humans could learn in months what had taken their ancestors years of trial and error to discover. The recovery also changed human social organization fundamentally. Before the bottleneck, human groups were probably similar to those of other great apes. Small family bands, limited cooperation between groups, territories defended aggressively. The bottleneck had forced cooperation on a scale never seen before. Small scattered populations couldn't afford internal conflict. Survival depended on maintaining connections with other groups, sharing resources during hard times, forming alliances against common threats. This cooperative imperative got baked into human psychology. We became the most pro-socially cooperative species on the planet. Not because we're naturally selfless, but because the bottleneck had eliminated anyone who couldn't work effectively with others. The humans who emerged from the crisis were hardwired for cooperation in ways their pre-bottleneck ancestors hadn't been. The genetic evidence for this is subtle but clear. Genes associated with social cognition, the ability to read others' emotions, to understand their intentions, to coordinate activities, show signs of strong selection pressure during and after the bottleneck. We became a species that was exceptional at reading each other, at forming and maintaining social bonds, at working together toward common goals. This had practical effects that show up in the archaeological record. Starting around 500,000 years ago, sites appear that were used repeatedly over long periods. Not temporary camps that were abandoned after a few weeks, but places groups returned to seasonally, sometimes for thousands of years. This suggests established territories, predictable resource use patterns, probably agreements between neighbouring groups about who hunted where and when. We see evidence of long-distance exchange networks, stone tools found hundreds of miles from the source of the raw material, shells from coastal areas showing up in inland sites. This wasn't random scavenging. This was trade. Groups maintaining relationships across vast distances, exchanging goods and probably information, creating the first human economic networks. By 400,000 years ago, the recovery had reached a critical threshold. Human populations were large enough and widespread enough that localized disasters no longer threatened the entire species. Groups occupied diverse environments across Africa, from tropical forests to Mediterranean coasts to semi-arid savannas. They had developed technologies and strategies specific to each environment, becoming effective specialists while maintaining the behavioral flexibility that had carried them through the bottleneck. And then something remarkable happened. The population didn't just stabilize at a sustainable level, it exploded. Between 400,000 and 300,000 years ago, human population size increased dramatically. Some estimates suggest the population grew tenfold or more during this period. This wasn't just recovery. This was expansion on a scale humans had never achieved before. What drove this population boom? Multiple factors, all interconnected. Climate had stabilized enough that resources were predictable, but still variable enough that humans' adaptability gave them advantages over more specialized species. Technology had reached a level where humans could exploit resources more efficiently than ever before. Social organization allowed larger groups to coordinate activities and defend larger territories. Most importantly, humans had developed what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the full suite of cognitive abilities that characterize modern humans. Abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, long-term planning, complex communication, all refined by the bottleneck into an unprecedented survival toolkit. This population expansion set the stage for the next great chapter in human evolution. The out-of-Africa migrations that would eventually populate the entire planet. But those migrations wouldn't happen for hundreds of thousands of years. First, the expanding African population had to fill available territories, develop the full range of modern human capabilities, and face one more great climate challenge that would push them beyond their ancestral home. By 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens in the technical sense, had emerged in Africa. They looked like us. Tall, gracile body structure, high foreheads and flat faces, chins, which seems like a minor detail but actually reflects major changes in jaw structure and speech capabilities. But they didn't necessarily think like us yet. The neurological wiring for fully modern cognition was there, installed by the bottleneck and refined over hundreds of thousands of years. But the cultural frameworks for expressing it, the art, the ritual, the symbolic thinking were still developing. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing sophistication in every domain. Stone tools become incredibly refined, with different styles appearing in different regions, suggesting distinct cultural traditions. The first evidence of systematic use of pigments appears: ochre and other coloured minerals gathered, processed, and probably used for body decoration or symbolic purposes. Beads and ornamental objects show up in the archaeological record, suggesting humans were creating and wearing symbols of identity and status. Most tellingly, we see evidence of what archaeologists call future-oriented behaviour, sites where stone tool raw materials were gathered and stockpiled for later use, seasonal camps positioned to take advantage of predictable resource availability months in advance. This wasn't just living day to day anymore. This was planning, imagining future scenarios, and preparing for them systematically. But the real explosion of human culture and capability came between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. This period, sometimes called the Great Leap Forward, though that term is controversial, saw the full emergence of behavioural modernity. Art appears in the archaeological record: carved figurines, painted rocks, decorated tools, deliberate burials with grave goods that suggest belief in an afterlife, or at least symbolic thinking about death and memory. Complex tools become standardized across large regions, suggesting widespread communication and cultural exchange. Bone needles appear, indicating fitted clothing, which would eventually allow humans to survive in cold climates their ancestors couldn't have tolerated. Fishing equipment shows up, hooks and nets and specialized spears for aquatic prey, demonstrating humans could now exploit resources that had been largely unavailable before. Most importantly, there's evidence of what archaeologists call symbolic material culture, objects that don't have obvious practical purposes but seem to convey meaning or identity. Beads made from specific materials arranged in specific patterns. Ochre used in ways that suggest ritual rather than practical application. Stone tools crafted with more care than their function required, suggesting aesthetic concerns beyond mere utility. This wasn't just recovery anymore. This was humans becoming fully modern in every sense. The genetic potential installed by the bottleneck, the behavioural flexibility and communication abilities and social cooperation, all of it was finally being expressed through increasingly sophisticated culture. And then, around 70,000 years ago, they started leaving Africa. Not the first attempt. There's evidence of earlier migrations out of Africa around 120,000 years ago. Small groups crossing into the Middle East, establishing temporary populations that ultimately didn't survive. But around 70,000 years ago, one particular migration succeeded. A relatively small group, maybe a few hundred individuals, crossed from the Horn of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. These few hundred people were the ancestors of every non-African human alive today. Everyone from Europe to Asia to the Americas traces their ancestry back to this single migration event. We know this from genetic analysis. All non-African populations show clear signs of descending from a population bottleneck much more recent than the Great Bottleneck 900,000 years ago. The genetic diversity of non-African populations is significantly lower than African populations, exactly what you'd expect if they all descended from a small founding group that left Africa recently. But why did this migration succeed when earlier ones had failed? The timing is revealing. 70,000 years ago was shortly after the Toba supervolcano eruption in Indonesia, the largest volcanic event of the last 2 million years. The eruption caused a volcanic winter that lasted years, possibly decades. Global temperatures dropped, food resources crashed. It was, in a smaller way, an echo of the great climate disaster that had caused the original bottleneck. And just like then, humans adapted. The groups that had left Africa shortly before the eruption carried with them the full toolkit of post-bottleneck survival strategies. They had sophisticated tools, complex social organization, behavioral flexibility, enhanced communication abilities. When Toba erupted and the climate crashed, they didn't just survive, they expanded. Moving into territories that had been occupied by other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, territories that were suddenly vulnerable because the volcanic winter had devastated established populations. The migration out of Africa wasn't a single wave. It was multiple movements over thousands of years. Groups moving along coastlines using their newly developed fishing skills to exploit marine resources. Groups moving inland, adapting to new prey animals and plant foods. Groups encountering and sometimes interbreeding with the evolutionary cousins they met, leaving genetic traces that persist in modern populations today. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia and Australia. By 40,000 years ago, they had spread across Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas, completing the colonization of every continent except Antarctica. This wasn't just population recovery. This was world domination by a species that, less than 1 million years earlier, had numbered only about 180 breeding individuals. The speed of this global expansion was unprecedented in evolutionary history. Other species might take millions of years to colonize multiple continents, adapting gradually to new environments through slow genetic change. Humans did it in less than 60,000 years, not through genetic adaptation, but through behavioral flexibility and cultural innovation. The same traits that had carried them through the bottleneck now allowed them to conquer the world. Everywhere humans went, they brought their post-bottleneck toolkit with them. The ability to innovate rapidly, the capacity for complex cooperation, the communication skills to share knowledge and coordinate activities, the behavioral flexibility to adapt to new challenges without requiring genetic change. In tropical environments, they developed technologies for forest living. In cold climates, they created fitted clothing and sophisticated shelters. In arid regions, they figured out water storage and food preservation. In coastal areas, they became master seafarers. Each new environment they encountered, they conquered within a few generations. Not through being physically superior, humans are actually relatively weak and slow compared to many animals, but through being behaviorally adaptable in ways no other species could match. The bottleneck had created the ultimate generalist species, not perfectly adapted to any one environment, but capable of adapting to virtually any environment through culture and technology, rather than biological evolution. By 10,000 years ago, humans were developing agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals that would allow population densities order of magnitude higher than hunting and gathering could support. By 5,000 years ago, they had created cities, writing, and complex civilizations. The population that had once numbered 1,080 now included millions of people living in organized societies across the globe. The recovery from the bottleneck was complete, but it had taken 900,000 years. 900,000 years from the depths of near-extinction to the emergence of civilization. 900,000 years of slow population growth, technological innovation, behavioral change, and eventually global expansion. It's the longest recovery in human history, and it made us who we are today. So here we are. 8 billion humans spread across every corner of the planet, cities that stretch for hundreds of miles, technologies that would seem like magic to people living just a century ago, a global civilization connected by invisible signals bouncing off satellites in space, and every single one of us, every person alive today can trace our ancestry back to those 1,280 individuals who survived 900,000 years ago. Think about that for a moment. Not symbolically or metaphorically, literally. Your ancestors survived the greatest population collapse in human history. They made it through 117,000 years of climate chaos, when 98.7% of the human population disappeared. They carried genes through that impossible bottleneck that are still in your body right now. The fact that you exist, that you're listening to this right now, is the result of the most improbable survival story in human evolution. But that incredible survival success came with costs. Costs we're still paying today. The genetic bottleneck didn't just reduce human numbers, it reduced human genetic diversity to levels that still make us one of the least genetically diverse species on the planet. When geneticists compare human DNA, they find something shocking. Any two humans, even ones from opposite sides of the planet with completely different appearances, are more genetically similar than two chimpanzees from neighbouring troops in the same African forest. We're all incredibly, almost impossibly, closely related. This lack of diversity shows up everywhere in modern medicine. Humans are vulnerable to the same diseases in ways that more genetically diverse species are not. A virus that can infect one human can potentially infect all humans, because our immune systems, shaped by that bottleneck, operate on variations of the same basic genetic themes. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just a modern phenomenon. It was partly a consequence of a near-extinction event 900,000 years ago that left all of humanity with similar vulnerabilities. The same pattern shows up with genetic diseases. Conditions like sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, these persist in human populations partly because our limited genetic diversity makes it easier for harmful mutations to spread and harder for natural selection to eliminate them quickly. In a more genetically diverse species, these conditions would be isolated to smaller populations. In humans, descended from a tiny founder population, they can affect millions. But perhaps the most significant medical implication is one we're only beginning to understand. The bottleneck selected for very specific survival traits that were advantageous in the desperate conditions of the late Pleistocene, but that might not be ideal for modern life. Our bodies were shaped by 117,000 years of barely surviving in a world of constant food scarcity, unpredictable climate, and enormous environmental stress. Those bodies, those genes, are now trying to operate in a world of abundant food, climate-controlled environments, and sedentary lifestyles. The mismatch shows up as epidemic levels of diabetes, heart disease, obesity. Our ancestors survived by being incredibly efficient at storing every extra calorie as fat. That was a survival advantage when the next meal was uncertain. Now it's killing us. The traits that saved our species are contributing to diseases that affect billions of people. But the legacy of the bottleneck isn't just biological, it's psychological and social too. Those 117,000 years of survival, selected for very specific behavioral traits. The ability to cooperate in small groups, the tendency to be suspicious of outsiders, the drive to compete for resources even when resources are abundant. The psychological architecture of modern humans was built during humanity's most desperate period, and we're still operating on that ancient programming. This shows up in ways both profound and troubling. Humans are incredibly good at forming tight-knit groups, families, tribes, communities, nations. We're wired for cooperation with people we recognize as part of our in-group. But we're equally wired to view outsiders with suspicion. The same psychological mechanisms that helped bottleneck survivors cooperate in small bands of 50 or 100, people now contribute to tribalism, racism, nationalism, all the ways we divide ourselves into us and them. The bottleneck survivors lived in a world where strangers were potential threats. Resources were scarce enough that competition between groups was literally a matter of survival. Those groups that cooperated internally while competing externally were the ones that made it through. Natural selection rewarded tribal thinking because tribal thinking worked in a world of genuine scarcity. But we're not living in that world anymore. At least most of us aren't. The planet produces enough food to feed everyone. Enough resources exist to provide decent lives for billions of people. The scarcity that shaped our psychology isn't absolute anymore. It's artificial. Created by distribution problems, political systems, economic structures. Yet we still think like bottleneck survivors. We still hoard resources we don't need. We still view members of other groups as competitors or threats. We still organize ourselves into competing tribes at every level, from street gangs to nuclear-armed nations. The psychology that saved us 900,000 years ago might be what destroys us in the 21st century. Because here's the thing, we're facing another potential bottleneck. Not as sudden or dramatic as the one that nearly killed us before, but potentially just as deadly. Climate change. The same force that almost extinguished humanity 900,000 years ago is threatening us again. Only this time, we're the ones causing it. The parallels are uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, ecosystems collapsing, species going extinct at rates not seen since the last mass extinction event, deserts expanding, coastlines flooding, agricultural zones shifting faster than civilizations can adapt. We know what happens during extreme climate change because our ancestors barely survived it. Populations collapse, societies fragment, resource conflicts intensify. The difference is scale. 900,000 years ago, there were maybe 18,000 humans total. Today there are 8 billion. Most living in cities that depend on complex supply chains and stable environmental conditions. Most relying on agricultural systems optimized for climate patterns that are changing rapidly. When the bottleneck hit our ancestors, they could disperse into whatever refuges the environment still supported. Where do 8 billion people disperse when the environment changes? There are no empty continents this time. No uninhabited valleys where survivors can wait out the crisis. We've filled every ecological niche on the planet. If climate change hits as hard as models predict, there's nowhere left to run. But here's where the legacy of the bottleneck offers something other than just warning. It also offers hope, because our ancestors survived. Against odds that should have been impossible, they made it through. And we carry their survival genes, their adaptability, their stubborn refusal to go extinct. The same flexibility that let modern humans outlast Neanderthals and Denisovans is still part of human nature. We are a species that innovates under pressure, that solves problems when survival depends on it, that cooperates when cooperation is necessary. The bottleneck taught humanity to be adaptable. The descendants who survived were the ones who could change strategies quickly, who could learn new skills, who could see solutions that others missed. That adaptability is our greatest asset in facing current environmental challenges. We've already started demonstrating it. Renewable energy technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago are now cost competitive with fossil fuels. Agricultural techniques that can maintain productivity with less water and less environmental impact are spreading globally. Carbon capture technologies that seem like science fiction are becoming reality. Humans are really good at innovation when we actually focus on a problem. The space race took us from first satellite to moon landing in just 12 years. The Manhattan Project developed nuclear weapons in under 4 years. The COVID vaccines went from concept to global distribution in less than a year. When humanity decides something is an existential priority, we can accomplish things that seem impossible. But here's the crucial difference between our current situation and the bottleneck our ancestors faced. They didn't choose the catastrophe that nearly killed them. It happened to them. We're choosing this one. Every year we delay serious climate action, we're rolling the dice on whether our civilization can adapt fast enough to survive the consequences. The bottleneck 900,000 years ago taught us that human populations can collapse. That species we think of as dominant and unstoppable can be reduced to tiny remnant populations clinging to survival in isolated refuges. That extinction isn't something that only happens to other species, it can happen to us. And here's what makes this moment in history so critical. Our ancestors didn't understand the forces that were trying to kill them. They couldn't predict climate shifts or volcanic winters. They just had to endure and hope they made the right survival choices. We don't have that excuse. We understand exactly what's happening. We can model future climate scenarios. We know what needs to be done to prevent the worst outcomes. We have the technology and resources to actually address the problem. What we're lacking isn't capability, it's collective will. And that brings us back to another lesson from the bottleneck. The survivors made it through because they cooperated. Small bands working together, sharing knowledge and resources, forming alliances that let them survive challenges no individual could face alone. That same cooperation needs to happen now at global scale. Climate change isn't a problem any single nation can solve. Rising seas don't respect national borders. Changing monsoon. Patterns affect entire continents. This is a challenge that requires the same kind of cooperation that saved our ancestors, just expanded to include the entire species. The question is whether we're capable of it, whether we can overcome the tribal psychology that served our ancestors so well in small groups, but that makes global cooperation so difficult, whether we can act like what we actually are, a single species with a shared fate, descended from a tiny population that survived by working together. There's something both humbling and empowering about understanding our place in deep time. Humbling because it reveals how close we came to never existing. If the climate had been just a little bit worse during the bottleneck, if the survivor population had dropped to 1,000 instead of 1,080, if any of 100 random factors had gone slightly differently, we wouldn't be here. Everything humanity has accomplished, every person who's ever lived, every work of art and scientific discovery and moment of love and connection, all of it only exists because of the narrowest possible escape from extinction. But it's also empowering because it shows what humans are capable of enduring. Our ancestors survived the unsurvivable. They faced environmental catastrophe that killed almost everyone, and they made it through. Not through luck alone, but through intelligence and cooperation and stubborn determination. Those traits, tested across 117,000 years of survival pressure, are still in us, still part of what makes us human. We're also more capable than our ancestors ever were. They faced the bottleneck with stone tools and small bands. We face current challenges with technologies they couldn't have imagined. They couldn't predict climate patterns or understand atmospheric chemistry or communicate instantly across the planet. We can. They couldn't deliberately modify their environment or develop new food sources or build massive infrastructure. We can. If humanity at its weakest and most vulnerable could survive the greatest climate catastrophe in our history, humanity at its most powerful and technologically advanced should be able to handle what's coming, should be able to. The uncertainty is whether we will. The story of the bottleneck is ultimately a story about choices. Choices made by individuals every day for 117,000 years. Choices about where to search for food. Choices about who to cooperate with. Choices about which skills to teach children. choices about whether to stay in familiar territory or take risks exploring new regions. All those individual choices made by people whose names we'll never know added up to survival, to us. We're facing the same kind of moment now. The choices we make as individuals and societies in the next few decades will determine whether human civilization survives the 21st century intact, or whether we're setting up our descendants for another bottleneck, one they might not survive. The difference is, this time we know what's coming. We have the genetic memory of the last near-extinction written in our DNA. We have the historical understanding of what climate catastrophe does to human populations. We have all the tools we need to make different choices than the ones that are leading us toward disaster. Whether we actually use those tools remains to be seen. But knowing where we came from, understanding how close we've already come to disappearing, should give us perspective, should make us think harder about the future we're creating, because the next bottleneck, if it comes, won't be caused by forces beyond our control. It'll be caused by choices we made when we still had time to choose differently. Our ancestors survived so we could be here. The question is whether we'll make the choices necessary so our descendants can be here too. That's the legacy of the bottleneck. Not just a story about the past, but a warning and a promise about the future. We've almost disappeared before. We can almost disappear again. But we can also survive. We can also adapt. We can also make the impossible possible. We've done it before. We carry the genes of bottleneck survivors. The question is whether we'll honour that legacy by surviving what comes next. So here we are, the end of an incredible journey through the deepest chapter of human history, a story that almost never got told because we almost weren't here to tell it. 900,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened to our ancestors. A climate disaster so severe that it reduced the entire human population to just 1,180 breeding individuals. For 117,000 years, roughly the same amount of time that separates us from the first modern humans, our species teetered on the absolute edge of extinction. One bad drought, one disease outbreak, one unusually harsh winter, and you wouldn't be listening to this right now. None of us would exist, but they survived. Against odds that would make lottery winners look commonplace. Those 1,080 individuals held on through over 1,000 centuries of environmental hell. They adapted, they innovated, they cooperated in ways no other species had ever managed. And when the world finally stabilized, they didn't just recover, they exploded. The genetic bottleneck had compressed human evolution like a coiled spring. When it released, humanity split into 3 separate species: modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. All 3 groups carried the scars of that near-extinction event, the fused chromosome that still sits in every cell of your body, the reduced genetic diversity that makes humans remarkably similar compared to other great apes, the cognitive adaptations that had been selected for during those desperate millennia. For hundreds of thousands of years, these 3 human species evolved along different paths, perfecting different survival strategies for different environments. But eventually they met again, and when they did, modern humans, the descendants of the African survivors who had faced constant environmental instability, proved to have one crucial advantage: flexibility. Not because we were stronger, we weren't. Not because we were smarter in some innate way, we weren't. But because we had been selected for adaptability over specialization. When Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared, it wasn't through violent extinction, it was through slow demographic replacement by a species that could just handle change a little bit better. Today, every single human alive is descended from that bottleneck population. The person sitting next to you on the bus, the barista who made your coffee this morning, every Nobel Prize winner, and every child taking their first steps. We all carry the genetic signature of survivors who refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. That's not just a historical curiosity, that's your heritage. Written in every cell of your body is the story of the most improbable survival in human history. The evidence of ancestors who looked at impossible odds and decided to keep going anyway. And honestly, there's something deeply comforting about that, especially when you're trying to fall asleep, knowing that you come from a lineage of survivors who face challenges that make our daily stresses look trivial. That the DNA you carry has been tested by literally hundreds of thousands of years of the worst conditions Earth could throw at it, and it's still here. You're still here. If you've made it this far into this journey through deep time, thank you. Seriously. In a world of short attention spans and endless distractions, you chose to spend time learning about something that happened almost 1,000,000 years ago. That matters. Understanding where we came from, what we survived, what made us human in the first place, that's not just interesting, it's essential. If you enjoyed this deep dive into humanity's closest brush with extinction, I'd love it if you could hit that like button. It helps other people find these stories. People who, like you, find something peaceful about understanding the vast sweep of human history, who like falling asleep to stories about real events that are somehow more incredible than any fiction. And I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from? What part of this story fascinated you most? Was it the genetic evidence that revealed the bottleneck? The moment when those three human species finally met again after 400,000 years? Or maybe just the sheer improbability that we're all here at all? If you want more content like this, more deep history for sleep, more stories about the incredible journey that brought us from nearly extinct ancestors to a species that dominates the entire planet, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more chapters in the human saga that deserve to be heard as you drift off to sleep. But for now, as you close your eyes and settle into rest, hold on to this thought. Every breath you take connects you to those 1,380 individuals who survived when survival seemed impossible. Every heartbeat echoes theirs. You're the answer to their struggle, the living proof that they succeeded against impossible odds. Sleep well, knowing you're part of the most resilient lineage in Earth's history. Rest easy in the knowledge that your ancestors faced the worst this planet could offer and came through stronger. And dream peacefully, because the story of human survival isn't over. It continues with you, every single day, every single moment. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, you're a survivor. It's literally in your DNA.